Oh, this is Sherlock Holmes, the Engineer's Thumb showcase PowerPoint. In the exposition at the beginning of the story, Dr. Watson begins to explain that by this point in his life, he had moved away from Holmes and had begun his own practice in another building. He mentions that he now gets patients that are city officials and other important roles, so he gets more prominent people in his office. And then he wakes up and the sharp knocking on the door. He answers the door to find his maid, who tells him to go downstairs to greet two men who had just arrived from Paddington. When he walks down the stairs, he finds a young, pale man dressed in a tweed suit and with a cloth cap with bandages around his head. The man starts telling the doctor about what had happened to make his hand look like that, and this prompts the start of the conflict. Now it's the rising action. The man introduces himself as Mr. Victor Hatherley, a hydraulic engineer who had just arrived by train. He begins to explain that he had a very serious accident the night before, making his hand like that. Dr. Watson then says something in a way that disturbs Mr. Hatherley, making him begin to laugh hysterically. Watson recognizes that this is not healthy and pours him a glass of water and hopes to calm him down. At work, the man calmed down enough to pull off the bandage and show Dr. Watson what had happened. His thumb had been seemingly torn off and replaced with a horrible spongy red surface. After this is done, he starts to tell Dr. Watson that there had been a murderous attack perpetrated on him. Hatherley mentions to Watson that this crime was a strange one, so Watson recommends his friend Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Hatherley agrees to visit Sherlock and they leave in a cab, starting their adventure. When they get to Baker Street, Hatherley begins to explain the full story to Holmes. Victor explains that he is a poor man running an unpopular practice with barely any visitors each day. One day, a very thin man named Colonel Lysander Stark walks into his practice and tells him that he seems to be a trustful man of the right qualifications who knows how to keep a secret. Mr. Stark tells Mr. Hatherley that the matter must be kept completely secret and goes through extreme measures to do so, like jumping out of the chair and checking to see if the clerk's listening behind him. He offers him a good sum of money for a night's work on a hydraulic stamping machine. At night, he must take a train to a place out in the country to work on the machine and meet Mr. Stark again. He explains that they had been mining for gold under their neighbor's yard and needed it to be a secret because if they were caught, they could get into legal trouble. When he got to reading, his carriage broke down and Mr. Stark grabbed him by the arm and pulled him into his own carriage. Stark was also staring at Hatherley with great intensity, as the story said, throughout the ride. The windows in the carriage were made of frosted glass, meaning that he couldn't see out. And at this point in the story, you can already tell that the conflict is caused by Colonel Lysander Stark, that Sherlock will have to catch him. The second part of the rising action, when they get to the house, it was pitch black and they had to get a lamp from a foreign woman who didn't appear to speak much English. Stark told him to wait in the room, and Hatherley notices that the window is sealed shut and the house is completely silent. The woman opens the door to the room and tells him that he should go and not stay at the house in broken English. Then she says, "Get away from here before it is too late." This did not scare Hatherley as he still wanted his money. Just as the woman left, Stark and another man came downstairs. He introduces himself as Stark's secretary and assistant, Mr. Ferguson. Stark noticed that the door was open but seemed to think almost nothing of it. The three men then walked upstairs for Hatherley to supposedly fix a hydraulics compressor. The machine was massive and compressed in a small room. At first, Hatherley noticed a leakage. This led to him discovering that they weren't using the machine for the purpose that they had claimed at all, which he was already suspicious of. Hatherley proceeded to tell Stark that he knew about the lie, prompting Stark to slam the door shut and lock Hatherley inside the room with the compressor. Mr. Stark then turned the machine on in hopes of killing Victor. Just as he was about to die, Hatherley noticed a small wooden door on the end in the room that he then jumped out of and fell to the ground. He lost consciousness for a second, and then the woman found him and told him how to escape. But just as he was leaving, Mr. Stark and the secretary ran up behind them. Stark had a butcher knife. Stark began running, and the woman tried to hold Stark back, revealing that his real name is Fritz when she yelled at him. Fritz pushes past her. Victor dropped his lamp, and Fritz proceeded to cut his thumb off just as he was jumping out of the house. After he had gotten away from Fritz, Hatherley passed out in the rose bushes. When he woke up, his hand was bandaged, and it appeared that they had spared his life and put him somewhere else. Next, he got on the train to see Watson, and Victor Hatherley's story started from there. After listening to the story and then thinking about it, Sherlock Holmes pulled out an advertisement from a year before the incident talking about how a hydraulic engineer named Jeremy Hayling had gone missing, connecting it to Hatherley's story. Sherlock alerts the police of what he discovered, and 3 hours later he finds himself on a train with Inspector Bradstreet of Scotland Yard and an ordinary-looking man heading for the house. After the crew has it all mapped out and where they are going, Sherlock says, "You were all wrong." He uses evidence from Mr. Hatherley's story that the horse pulling the carriage seemed fresh and glossy on arrival to conclude that the house must not be that far away. This means that the gang lied to Hatherley about how far they had gone on the trip. With information from the inspector, Holmes realizes that the gang are using a machine to form the amalgam, which has taken the place of silver in the form of coins, selling it to make a large sum of money. When they find the house, it is discovered that it had been set on fire during the night and was only a Dr. Becker who had been living with a foreigner as if he who looks as if good a little good Berkshire beef would do him no harm. Sherlock then realizes that when this Victor dropped his oil lamp, it had set fire to the wooden walls of the house. This means that the crime had already been foiled before Holmes had even learned of it. Unfortunately, unless burnt by the fire, the woman assistant, who was actually Dr. Becker, and Fritz were long gone. This means that the conflict had already ended before the story had started. So now the falling action starts, and the climax was very anticlimactic, thus ending the conflict on a somewhat unresolved note. Earlier in the day, a poor man had spotted several possible members of the gang carrying suspicious boxes headed for reading. No one, not even Holmes, could find out where these people went. At the house, the firemen had discovered Hatherley's thumb on the window sill just where it should have been. Along with this, they found large amounts of nickel and tin in an outhouse. This leads investigators to conclude that the coins were in the boxes. No one ever found a single piece of the machine that almost killed Victor Hatherley in the ruined house either. Normal investigators could not find out who carried the Victor away, so this was left up to Holmes. In the resolution of the story, Sherlock uses his amazing ingenuity and deduction skills to conclude that the story went like this. For at least a year, there had been a gang consisting of several other men, a foreign woman named Elise, a foreign man named Fritz, and an Englishman who goes by the title of Dr. Becker. They owned a house in the country, but not too far from town, where they manufactured amalgam and made lots of money off of it. When the hydraulic compressor they were using first broke, they called in a Mr. Jeremiah Haley, who fixed the machine. After this was done, Fritz supposedly murdered Hayling, and no one ever found the body. A year after this initial incident, the machine broke again. This time they called another hydraulic engineer named Victor Hatherley, who they told to keep it a secret. Mr. Mr. Hatherley met Fritz, and they both got on the carriage. The carriage had frosted windows so that they could not see where they were going. This let Fritz tell Victor that they had gone 12 miles when they had gone a much shorter distance in reality, as the horse pulling the carriage wasn't tired when they arrived. Once upstairs in the house, Hatherley began working on the machine and quickly notices that Fritz had lied to him about the purpose of having it there. Noticing that his plot was almost discovered, Fritz slams the door on Hatherley, locks it, and turns the compressor on. Just as Mr. Hatherley is about to be crushed, he notices a small wooden door in the room, which he then jumps out of. He lands in a corridor where Elise, much less insane than Fritz, pulls him up and tells him to escape out of the window. Just as he gets up, Fritz and Becker come around the corner with a butcher knife. Victor drops his lantern, and Elise tries to stop Fritz from killing Victor, but he pushes past her just as Victor is jumping out of the window. Fritz chops his thumb off. Fritz, I mean, not Fritz. Victor falls unconscious after the fall. While Fritz is away, Elise and Dr. Becker pick up his body and carry him back to town so that Fritz doesn't kill him. Meanwhile, the house was burning down because Victor had dropped his lantern on the floor, which had caused a fire that spread to the wooden walls. When Victor woke up, he told the train he took the train to Watson. At the end of the story, Holmes tells Hathaway that the only thing that he gained out of this was experience. Indirectly, it may be of value. And these are 5 short story elements used in the story. First was foreshadowing. When Dr. Watson was walking down the stairs to get to his new patient, his guard tells him he's all right and jerks his thumb over his shoulder. The text reads, "I've got him here," he whispered, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "He's all right," in paragraph 4, sentence 1. This shows that the guard is disturbed by something regarding a thumb and foreshadows that the new patient will be missing a thumb. Number 2 is hyperbole. In paragraph 5 of the text, the sentence says, "What is it then?" I asked for his manager suggested that it was some strange creature which he had caged up in my room. This is a hyperbole because there would never be a strange creature caged up in his consulting room. Dr. Watson was of course not expecting a creature when he walked down the stairs, just another person in a precarious situation. Number 3 is irony. Sentence 1 of paragraph 11 in the story. The text reads, "Oh, my night could not be called monotonous," said he, and laughed. This is dramatic irony because the one talking, Mr. Hatherley, is aware of a situation that the doctor isn't. Usually his nights would be monotonous, but because his thumb was cut off, that made it even more interesting. Number 4 is simile. In the first sentence of paragraph 71, the story reads, "He suddenly sprang up, darting like lightning across the room. He flung open the door." This is a simile because it compares two things that aren't related. The man could also not possibly go as fine as lightning, so that's hyperbole too. And the fifth one is tone. In lines 3 to 4 of paragraph 98, the text says, "He sat at my side in silence all the time, and I was aware more than once when I glanced in his direction that he was looking at me with great intensity." This shows that Mr. Stark, or Fritz, is coming off as a very strange and creepy man, meaning that the tone of his character and sentence are strange. And here are 5 forensic elements / deductive conclusions. The first one is, well, the best example of a forensic element in the story is that the engineer's thumb is visibly chopped off, making the strange story of Mr. Hatherley a little more believable. In this story, there is a good deductive conclusion that isn't even made by Sherlock Holmes. When Mr. Hatherley looked at the main chamber of the hydraulic press, he realizes that the machine was far too powerful for it to be used for what they say it was, so they must have been lying. Number 3, after Victor Hatherley is done telling the story, Sherlock pulls out a book with an advertisement in it that said, "Lost on the 9th inst. Mr. Jeremiah Haling, aged 26, a hydraulic engineer. Left his lodgings at 10 o'clock at night and has not been heard of since. Was dressed in," etc. Sherlock Holmes deduces that this missing person report must be related to the case that he is currently solving because of the close similarities between them. Number 4, early on in Victor Hatherley's story, he had mentioned that the horse looked fresh and glossy when he first arrived at the house by carriage. Holmes used this detail to conclude that the house must not be that far into the country, if at all. Number 5 is Inspector Bradford and Sherlock Holmes worked together to conclude that an unknown gang that the inspector had traced back to the town which was forming the amalgam that had taken the place of Silver was the same gang using the hydraulic press to attack Mr. Hatherley. The last slide is the engineer's thumb character traits chart. So first there's Sherlock Holmes. First of all, he's extremely smart with a 190 IQ. He makes amazing deductions and finds / connects forensic evidence very quickly. And he never tells anyone about his conclusions until the crime is solved, sometimes making it take longer for an arrest. And sometimes doesn't rat out the criminal. And Dr. Watson is a doctor, but still not as smart as Sherlock Holmes. And he rarely adds anything to the story other than narration and a few other parts. He runs a prominent practice now, with many prominent patients, making the doctor a prominent member of society. And Victor Hatherley's story is hysterical because of pain in a terrible situation. He's resistant to pain, and he's poor, and he's an orphan that runs a practice with barely any customers, meaning that he'd do almost anything for money. And Lysander Stark, or Fritz, is very eccentric, and he's constantly anxious that he may be caught. And he's creepy because he stares at Hatherley during the ride to the house. and